Brian Smith arrived at the ranch with mixed emotions, a suitcase in one hand and a heavy heart weighing him down. The house stood before him, weathered and beaten, a reflection of time's relentless passage. The roof sagged, the porch leaned dangerously to one side, and the faded paint hinted at a once vibrant past. This wasn't just a house. It was a repository of memories and a representation of his father's dream. Yet in its current state it felt more like a burden than a blessing. He unpacked his car slowly, his movements deliberate as he tried to come to terms with his new reality. His father's dog, Bear, a scruffy mutt with a wagging tail and soulful eyes, padded up to him, offering a silent but comforting welcome. The companionship was unexpected but welcome. Bear followed Brian everywhere, almost as if sensing the loneliness he carried. Inside the house, the air was thick with the smell of mildew and old wood. Dust motes floated in the sunlight streaming through the cracked windows, and Brian couldn't help but think about how his parents would have tackled the repairs together. His father with his trusty tool belt and his mother, offering cheerful encouragement. Those images brought a bittersweet ache to his chest. The first few days were a whirlwind of small tasks, clearing cobwebs, patching holes, and trying to make the house livable. Brian's hands, accustomed to a keyboard, grew rough with calluses as he repaired the porch and patched up the roof. Each task was a reminder of his father's resourcefulness, and with every nail driven and plank replaced, the house began to feel a little more like home. It wasn't just the physical work that occupied his time. Brian found solace in reconnecting with the land. His father's dream ranch stretched far and wide, with rolling hills and a creek that meandered lazily through the back. Exploring the property became a daily ritual. There was a quiet beauty to it all, the rustle of leaves, the chirping of birds, and the steady sound of the creek flowing. He stumbled upon an old bench his father had placed by the water, and sitting there, Brian felt an odd sense of connection, as though his father's spirit lingered in the land he'd loved so dearly. One afternoon, while walking near the house, Brian noticed a patch of ground overrun with weeds. He decided to clear it, inspired by memories of his mother's garden from his childhood. She had always loved flowers, and their yard had been a kaleidoscope of color: roses, daisies, and marigolds in every hue. Digging his hands into the soil felt grounding, and as he worked, he imagined her voice, encouraging him to keep going. Soon, the patch transformed into a modest garden, a small tribute to her that filled him with a quiet pride. The days turned into weeks, and though the work was physically demanding, Brian found it oddly fulfilling. The ranch was beginning to change, and so was he. The isolation forced him to slow down, to think, and to confront the grief he'd buried for so long. It wasn't easy. Grief rarely is, but in the stillness of the countryside he began to feel a sense of healing. Each sunrise brought a new sense of purpose, and each evening as the sky turned shades of orange and pink, Brian found himself sitting on the porch with Bear at his side, reflecting on the day's work. Slowly the ranch began to feel less like an obligation and more like a chance to rebuild not just a house but himself. One crisp Sunday morning, Brian stepped out onto the porch with a cup of coffee in hand. The ranch was quiet, the only sounds being the chirping of birds and Bear's soft snuffling as he investigated the yard. Brian felt a rare moment of peace as he surveyed the garden he had planted. The bright flowers and thriving vegetables reminded him of his mother, and for the first time in a while he felt a sense of accomplishment. That calm was shattered by the crunch of tires on gravel. A sleek black BMW, its windows tinted so dark that he couldn't see the driver, rolled into the driveway. Brian frowned. Nobody he knew drove a car like that, especially not in this remote area. His first thought was that they were lost, but the sinking feeling in his gut told him otherwise. The car door opened and out stepped a woman who looked completely out of place. She was tall, immaculately dressed in a tailored navy blazer, and wearing heels that clearly weren't made for dirt roads. Her blonde hair was styled in a flawless twist, and she carried a leather bag that practically screamed money. Everything about her appearance was polished, calculated, and unsettling. Brian straightened, brushing the dirt from his hands onto his jeans, and waited for her to speak. She took her time, her sharp gaze sweeping over the house, the garden, and the land before finally settling on him. When she did, her expression carried a faint air of disapproval, as though she had expected someone more refined. "You must be Brian," she said, her voice cool and clipped. "Yeah," he replied, crossing his arms. "And you are?" "Susan Harrington," she said as though the name should mean something to him. When he didn't react, she added, I was close with your father. The words hit him like a gut punch. He stared at her, waiting for her to elaborate, but she didn't. Instead, she turned her gaze back to the house, a flicker of emotion softening her features. It's strange being here again, she murmured. I haven't been back since David passed. Hearing his father's name from her lips set Brian's teeth on edge. He didn't know who this woman was, but the implication that she had a history with his father made his stomach churn. If you're selling something, I'm not interested, Brian said flatly, trying to steer the conversation. If there's something else, you might want to get to the point. Her faint smile vanished, replaced by a hard, unyielding expression. I'm not here to sell anything, she said sharply. I'm here because this ranch rightfully belongs to me. Brian blinked, caught completely off guard. Excuse me, he said, his voice edged with disbelief. Susan's posture straightened, her chin lifting slightly as though daring him to challenge her. Your father and I were in a relationship, she said. After your mother passed, we became very close. He proposed to me not long before his death, and he promised me that this ranch would be ours. For a moment, Brian couldn't speak. The words swirled in his head, clashing with every memory he had of his father. None of this made sense. His father had never mentioned anyone named Susan, let alone a serious relationship. The idea that he had promised the ranch to this stranger felt like a slap in the face. That's impossible, Brian finally said, his voice tight with anger. My dad never told me anything about you. Susan's smile returned, cold and condescending. I'm not surprised, she said. You two weren't exactly close after your mother passed, were you? Her words struck a nerve and Brian clenched his fists. Even if that's true, he said firmly, the ranch was left to me in his will. That's legally binding. Whatever he might have told you doesn't change that. Susan reached into her bag and pulled out a manila folder. From it, she produced a stack of photos, holding them out to him. Brian hesitated, but his curiosity got the better of him. He took the photos and flipped through them. The first showed Susan and his father at a restaurant, smiling for the camera. The next was of his father holding her hand, a small velvet box in his other hand. Each photo felt like another piece of evidence that his father had kept an entire life hidden from him. He loved me, Susan said, her voice trembling slightly. We were building a future together. He promised me this ranch. Brian handed the photos back, his jaw tight. A verbal promise doesn't override a legal will, he said bluntly. This ranch is mine. Susan's mask of calm cracked and her tone turned sharp. You're going to regret this, Brian, she snapped. This ranch isn't yours. It's ours, and I'll make sure the law sees it that way. Brian expected her to leave after that, but Susan had other plans. She pulled out her phone, stepped away, and began dialing. When she started speaking, her voice carried clearly across the yard. Yes, I'd like to report a trespasser on my property, she said, her tone authoritative. He's refusing to leave and becoming aggressive. Brian stared at her, stunned. You've got to be kidding me, he muttered. Pulling out his own phone, he dialed 911 and calmly explained the situation, emphasizing that he had the legal paperwork to prove his ownership of the ranch. By the time the call ended, the faint sound of sirens echoed in the distance. When the police arrived, Susan wasted no time rushing to them, presenting her side of the story with dramatic flair. Brian, meanwhile, leaned against the porch railing, waiting patiently for his turn. He handed over the will and property deeds, his voice steady as he explained the situation. The officers reviewed the documents and spoke to both parties. Finally, one of them turned to Susan and said, Ma'am, a verbal promise isn't legally binding. If you believe you have a legitimate claim, you'll need to take it to court. For now, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Susan's face turned red with fury. This isn't over, she hissed, glaring at Brian before storming back to her car. You'll be hearing from my lawyer. The relief Brian felt after Susan's departure was short-lived. Just a week later, a manila envelope arrived at the ranch. Inside were court documents. Susan was suing him for the ranch. She claimed that her relationship with Brian's father and his verbal promise entitled her to ownership. The news was a gut punch. Brian sat at the kitchen table, the papers spread out before him, feeling the weight of the looming battle. His father's will was clear, but the idea of being dragged into court over something so personal felt like salt in a wound that had barely begun to heal. Brian hired a lawyer, Maria Carson, a sharp and experienced attorney with a reputation for her tenacity. He was confident they could win. "The will is ironclad," Maria assured him during their first meeting. "Unless she has some extraordinary evidence, there's no way she'll succeed." But even her confidence couldn't erase the dread Brian felt as the legal process began. In the weeks leading up to the trial, Brian struggled to focus on anything but the case. Susan's legal team painted her as a devoted partner to his father, a woman who had been there for him in his darkest moments after losing his wife. They presented photos, text messages, and even witnesses who testified about the relationship. Some of the evidence was hard to stomach. Intimate moments between his father and Susan that Brian had never known about. It felt like a betrayal, like his father had lived a secret life. The courtroom sessions were grueling. Susan took the stand and her testimony was an emotional whirlwind. She broke down in tears, recounting how much she had loved Brian's father and how they had planned a future together. Her words were designed to tug at the heartstrings, and Brian couldn't help but feel the weight of her grief, even as he resented her for dragging him into this mess. When it was Brian's turn to testify, he stuck to the facts. He explained the clear terms of his father's will and property deeds, emphasizing that his father's dream had always been for the ranch to stay in the family. "My father worked his whole life to build this place," Brian said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "He wanted it to be my legacy just as much as it was his." Maria's arguments were precise and compelling. She pointed out the lack of legal documentation to support Susan's claims and reminded the court that verbal promises could not override a will. "While we understand Ms. Harrington's feelings," Maria said in her closing statement, "this case is about facts, not emotions. And the facts clearly show that the ranch belongs to Brian Smith." The waiting period for the judge's decision felt like an eternity. Brian spent those days pacing the house, replaying every moment of the trial in his mind. He tried to focus on the ranch, throwing himself into repairs and tending to the garden, but the looming uncertainty was impossible to escape. Finally, the day of the ruling arrived. Brian sat in the courtroom, his heart pounding as the judge read the verdict. The decision was in his favor. The will was upheld and Susan's claim was dismissed. Relief washed over Brian, but it was tempered by the emotional toll of the ordeal. As Susan left the courtroom, she glanced back at him, her expression unreadable. The victory was bittersweet. Brian had won the legal battle, but it had dredged up feelings he hadn't been prepared to confront. Anger at his father for keeping secrets, guilt for their estranged relationship, and a lingering sadness for the love his father had found but never fully shared with him. The ranch, once a symbol of loss, now felt like a battleground for his family's legacy. Though the legal fight was over, Brian knew the emotional scars would take much longer to heal. He had defended his father's dream, but at what cost? The weight of the past pressed down on him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a deeper journey toward understanding and reconciliation. In the weeks following the trial, life on the ranch returned to its quiet rhythm, but for Brian, peace remained elusive. Although the legal battle was over, the emotional scars lingered. The ranch, which had once started to feel like a sanctuary, now carried the weight of unresolved feelings. Anger at his father for the secrets he'd kept, sadness for the love his father had found and lost, and a strange, nagging sense of empathy for Susan. He began searching for ways to cope, revisiting the creek bench where his father used to sit. The sound of the water brought moments of clarity, but the emotional burden never fully lifted. One Sunday morning, on a whim, Brian decided to attend the small church in town where his mother had once taken him as a child. It had been years since he'd stepped into a church, but something about the pastor's words on forgiveness and grace struck a chord deep within him. At first, Brian sat in the back, slipping in just before the service started and leaving before anyone could engage him in small talk. Over time, however, he began staying a little longer. The pastor's messages seemed to resonate with the struggles he was facing, offering guidance on letting go of anger and learning to forgive, not just others but also himself. Brian joined a Bible study group and found himself surrounded by people who listened without judgment. He began volunteering for community projects, rebuilding homes damaged by storms and organizing food drives for families in need. Each act of service gave him a sense of purpose, a way to channel his emotions into something meaningful. Slowly, the weight he carried began to lighten. Then one Sunday everything changed. As Brian settled into his usual spot at the back of the church, he caught sight of someone who didn't quite blend into the familiar crowd. It was Susan. Her sharp, polished demeanor was gone, replaced by a softer, almost hesitant presence. She sat near the front, her head slightly bowed as if trying not to draw attention to herself. Brian's first instinct was to leave before the service ended, avoiding any potential confrontation. But curiosity kept him rooted to his seat. What was she doing here? Was this some kind of stunt, or had she truly been affected by the events of the trial? When the service ended, Brian lingered near the exit, watching as Susan exchanged a few quiet words with the pastor before heading his way. His heart pounded as she approached, her expression nervous but determined. "Brian," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. There was no trace of the combative woman who had called the police on him or dragged him to court. Instead, she looked vulnerable. "Do you have a moment to talk?" He hesitated but finally nodded. "Sure." They stepped outside into the sunlight, standing a few feet apart. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Susan took a deep breath and began, her voice trembling slightly. "I owe you an apology," she said, her eyes downcast. "A big one. I've had a lot of time to think about everything that happened and I realize now how wrong I was. I let my grief and anger consume me and instead of dealing with it the right way I took it out on you. I'm so sorry, Brian." Brian stared at her, caught off guard by the sincerity in her voice. This wasn't the Susan he remembered. This was someone humbled by her experiences, someone genuinely trying to make amends. "I've been coming here for a few months now," she continued, glancing back toward the church. "Trying to find peace. The pastor has been helping me and I've been praying for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it after everything I did, but I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me." The anger Brian had been holding on to, the resentment, the frustration, rose to the surface, threatening to overwhelm him. He wanted to yell, to demand answers, to ask why she thought she deserved forgiveness after everything she'd put him through. But instead he thought about the pastor's sermons, about the power of grace and the importance of letting go. "I forgive you," Brian said quietly, the words heavier than he expected. Susan's eyes widened in surprise. "Really?" she whispered. "Yeah," he said with a nod. "Not because what you did was okay, but because holding on to this anger isn't helping either of us. I don't want to carry it around anymore." Tears filled Susan's eyes and she nodded. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "You have no idea what that means to me." For the first time they talked, not as adversaries but as two people who had loved the same man in different ways. Susan shared stories about Brian's father that he had never heard before. How they had met, how his father had struggled to move on after losing his wife, and how Susan had tried to help him find happiness again. It was painful to hear, but it also gave Brian a new perspective. His father had been human, flawed and grieving, but also searching for peace in his own way. By the end of their conversation something had shifted. The resentment Brian had carried for months began to fade, replaced by a sense of understanding. He couldn't change the past, but he could honor his father's memory by moving forward with a lighter heart. After that conversation with Susan, the weight Brian had been carrying for months began to ease. Forgiving her didn't erase the pain of the past, but it allowed him to start letting go of the resentment and anger that had held him back. He could finally see that Susan, like him, had been navigating her own grief, trying to find her way through the loss of someone they both loved. Life on the ranch took on a new rhythm. With the legal battle behind him and his emotional wounds beginning to heal, Brian found himself thinking more about the legacy his parents had left him. The ranch wasn't just land or a house. It was a symbol of their love, their dreams, and the values they had instilled in him. For the first time he felt ready to embrace that legacy fully. One day during a church service, the pastor spoke about community and the power of shared spaces. The message resonated deeply with Brian, sparking an idea that had been slowly forming in the back of his mind. The ranch, he realized, could be more than just his personal sanctuary. It could be a place where others could find peace, healing, and connection just as he had. Brian began reaching out to the church community, offering the ranch as a space for gatherings, retreats, and events. The garden he had planted in memory of his mother became a favorite spot for quiet reflection, its vibrant blooms offering a sense of hope to everyone who visited. The old barn, which had been neglected for years, was transformed into a warm, welcoming space for Bible studies, youth group meetings, and small celebrations. The first event was a community prayer retreat, And as Brian watched families gather on the porch, children laughing and running through the fields, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The ranch was coming alive in a way he had never imagined, becoming a place where people could connect with each other and with their faith. Susan also became part of this transformation. She volunteered to help with the events, her polished exterior replaced by a genuine warmth and humility. Over time, she and Brian formed an unlikely friendship, bonded by their shared love for the man who had brought them together in such an unexpected way. Susan's stories about Brian's father, once painful to hear, became a source of comfort, helping him piece together a fuller picture of the man he had looked up to but never fully understood. As the months passed, the ranch became a cornerstone of the community, a place where people came to celebrate milestones, find solace in difficult times and build relationships. For Brian, it was more than he had ever hoped for. The laughter of children in the fields, the sound of hymns drifting from the barn, and the sight of people finding peace on the land his father had cherished brought a sense of purpose he had never experienced before. One morning, as the sun rose over the hills, Brian stood on the porch with Bear at his side. The golden light bathed the ranch in warmth, illuminating the garden, the creek, and the old farmhouse that had become his home. He thought about his parents and the journey that had brought him to this moment. The pain of loss, the conflict with Susan, and the work he had poured into the ranch had all led to something beautiful, a place where his family's legacy could thrive. For the first time in years, Brian felt at peace. He knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but he also knew he wasn't walking it alone. The community he had found, the connections he had built, and the lessons he had learned had all become part of his story. The ranch wasn't just his inheritance, it was a gift, a chance to honor the past while creating something meaningful for the future. As the sun climbed higher into the sky, Brian smiled and turned back toward the house, ready to face whatever the day might bring. The ranch, once a symbol of grief and obligation, had become a testament to love, resilience, and the power of second chances. And in that moment, Brian knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. How did Brian's transformation inspire you? Did you find his journey relatable or impactful? What are your thoughts on Susan's redemption arc? Do you think her actions were fully justified by her grief? How would you have reacted if you were in Brian's position? Would you have been able to forgive Susan? What does the story teach about forgiveness, community, and honoring one's legacy? If you could continue the story, what direction would you take? How might the ranch evolve in the years to come? If you enjoyed this story and want to see more heartwarming, drama-filled tales like this, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to HOA Havoc for your regular dose of captivating stories. And hey, turn on that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching, and as always, see you in the next one.